Well, I'm delighted to be here with Tara Isabella Burton. She is a writer who has just written a new book called Self-Made. She's done a really interesting book previously that is on a related topic called Strange Rights. So, as I understand it, you actually have a doctorate in theology.
Yes, I started out, my doctorate's in the 19th century French literature and theology, and I sort of started out as an academic theologian and then left for journalism and still try to balance those two quite different sort of strains of inquiry.
Yeah. So, Strange Rights, the basic argument was that religion, institutional religion, had morphed into something different, and that there actually was still a lot of religiosity, even though people were not going to, legacy churches. But a lot of that religion really was actually about the self, and it seems to me that self-made is, in a way, a continuation of that argument. But do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think sometimes I worry that as a theologian, it's sort of everything looks like theology to me. But what I'm particularly interested in, both in Strange Rights and in Self-Made, is this divinization of the self, or the way in which the self is reimagined downstream of wider changing cultural attitudes about God and about authority. And the conclusion I come to with slightly different approaches in each book is that our contemporary world is characterized by this kind of, to say worship of the self would probably be an overstatement, but by a conviction that our truest, our most authentic, our realist selves, sort of whatever adverb you want there, or whatever adjective you want there, is defined by what we want, that our desires, our ability to envision who we want to be, or our desire to kind of experience something in the world is somehow authoritative, that our cosmology is determined by our desires.
So if we could just stay on the intellectual archaeology of this idea, I guess one of the reasons that your book appealed to me was it was very similar, and it actually fleshed out a lot of the things that I tried to argue in my book on identity. And actually there I said that Martin Luther, in a certain way, was critical in this transformation, because he's the one who began to argue that it's really the inner believer that's at the core of being a Christian, and that all of the external social customs, that were dictated by the Catholic Church had nothing to do with, true Christianity. And so you'd get this division between an inner self and an outer world that valorizes the inner self over the outer one. And then you get secular thinkers like Rousseau that just make this explicit, that it's really that inner person. I mean, would you say that that's a accurate description of kind of the intellectual journey that the Western world has gone on?
Absolutely. And I think that sort of plenty of historians have already written about the relationship between the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. But I think we can see, not to blame the Protestants for everything, I'm one, but I do think that there is something about the private relationship of the self, A, to text, and B, to God, these sort of two very different dialogues come together in this idea that there is something authentic or real or true about our internal state. And I think that the more that the pendulum has shifted towards seeing that as authoritative, I think we've become perhaps too quick to think about our social architecture, our wider world as being constructed or unreal, not just not authoritative, but not having any ontological weight.
So let's talk about Self-Made. It's a book that consists of a whole series of vignettes, and it starts at a very unexpected place with the German painter Albrecht Dürer. So why don't you talk a little bit about, why is he an example of, this phenomenon of that valorization of the inner self?
One of the things that fascinates me about Dürer is that he's a perhaps we could call him an artistic genius, obviously, in the creative sense, but he also had this sort of twinned genius for self-promotion, for creating himself as a work of art, often in his own work as a background character, or sometimes even in his self-portraits as a foreground character. And separately, he has this sort of whole other industry in pioneering the use of engravings such that he's able to he is the designer and his work is being mass-produced in a very particular way. And this sort of combination between artistic genius, self-divinization, several of his self-portraits involve him sort of depicting himself in traditional attitudes that would otherwise have been reserved for Christ, and his ability to kind of massage public opinion, say, to kind of emphasize this genius publicly, I think tie into a trend that we see starting in the Renaissance, which is a cult of the genius that is related to anxieties about social mobility. We're talking, and of course this is a bit reductionist, but we're talking about a time of relatively unprecedented social mobility where certain kinds of skill or craftsmanship could allow a talented person to leapfrog the social order. And this gets tied up with narratives in so much Renaissance philosophical discourse about the idea of the liminal figure, the person who doesn't quite fit, often characterized as a bastard, or a demigod, someone who is their legal father, their earthly father might be a humble peasant, but in some sense their true parent, their real parent is nature herself. And this is a recurring motif we find in discourses of true mobility, where the true noble is the one who has this kind of innate relationship with nature or fortune that allows him, usually him, to transcend his social station. And so genius becomes tied up with these other ideas of there being something innately special about some people that allows them to do this relatively unprecedented thing of transform their circumstances. And in Self-Made, I trace this tendency or this connection throughout history as it goes from something quite narrow, the genius is a kind of demigod, to this idea that there is something divine in the act of choosing, that our desire to transform our circumstances has a kind of reality of its own, and in fact, we are who we want to be.
So that concept gets transformed, though. I mean, so I think that the idea that there's a hidden genius that is being suppressed by society is a familiar trope, and in a way you can be very sympathetic with that, because in fact society does keep very talented people back, but you get this transformation that occurs at some point in the 18th, 19th centuries, where it's not actually a genius, or the people may have a certain genius for the way they dress or the way they look, but they're not like a Beethoven or a Van Gogh that's simply being, disrespected or not recognized. I mean, one interesting one was, that story of Diderot, Le Neveu de Rameau. That's actually quite interesting that you refer to that, because Hegel actually talks about that story, and also Lionel Trilling in Sincerity and Authenticity points to that as a kind of seminal point at which Europeans began reimagining that inner self.
Yes. I mean, he's a fascinating figure, Rameau's nephew, and it's sort of in the chapter I look at both at the Marquis de Sade, a kind of real life figure whose writing's a bit more obviously unsettling. But what I find that these Enlightenment figures share is this interest in originality as in and of itself, that to be original, to be different, to be creative, and in being creative, supplanting the traditional role of God as an exercise of power. And I link it in my book to what I call the disenchantment of custom, this idea that our social lives, the world in which we live, is not necessarily divinely ordered or doesn't have a kind of weight, but is merely, as so many of these writers, Diderot, Rousseau, Montaigne a little earlier, right? It's just custom. It's just convention. Everything that we do is simply arbitrary. And there's this sort of wonderful fascinating kind of literary tradition around this time of the traveler's tale, where an explorer goes to a foreign land and they do things differently there. And the kind of subtext is, well, if they do things differently there, then from here, you know, there's clearly nothing universally true about our social order. And so once you disenchant custom, the question becomes sort of, where is the enchantment? What is the source of meaning? And I think that these sort of more villainous or perverse figures that we find in Enlightenment literature are prescient in the way that they conceive of sort of the exercise of power for power's sake, but creatively. It's not even necessarily power over, it's simply to tell a lie for the pleasure of telling the lie. This becomes a kind of an exercise of power that separates the creative person, the person who is a kind of demigod, from the masses, the sheep, the people who merely exist to be convinced or consumed.
But how does the Marquis de Sade fit into this? Because he's not particularly creative. He's actually a really bad person.
Absolutely. I mean, I get annoyed about this, that there's a sort of cult of de Sade now, and made worse by films like Quills, that will sort of rehabilitate him as he was a figure for free speech, and he was imprisoned only for his sexy and daring ideas, when in fact most of his imprisonments were for sexual assault, or what would we call today sexual assaults. But I think that in these graphic sexual perverse writings, something that de Sade is obsessed with is this idea that simultaneously there is no God and we have to kill him. It's this odd tension within a lot of his works where there is both because there is no external moral authority, we can do anything, and yet the possibility that there might be a moral authority out there in the ether is sufficiently galling and destabilizing to his libertine murderer rapist characters that they have to perform acts of blasphemy to kind of reassert themselves in their world. And I think that his work, which is I don't recommend anyone read, it's very unpleasant.
I remember I actually read one of his books when I did a lot of French literature when I was younger. And I read it in French, and then there are all these words that so then I looked it up in the dictionary. I said, oh, that's what it means. Yuck.
Ooh, can't imagine reading it like that. But I think what is interesting about de Sade is precisely the way that he and his work stand and this turning point, liminal space for conversations about God, where God haunts the world of Sade. And so, and as I think the potential for God still haunts us, but where we are, I think, as modern people, caught between transgression as something to prove and transgression as something that is, in fact, stabilizing. Because if we are transgressing, at least it means there's something to transgress against. But I think, and perhaps that's a sort of additional element of de Sade in the story of self-making. But his own obsession with the idea that we can become gods, and that the way to become gods is to do things that no one else has done before. That our humanity is something we have to prove and earn through the creative act, and in his text often creatively thinking about ritualistic ways to murder someone. But it is an act of, in his mind, creativity. And of course, there's the additional sort of irony that in de Sade's own life, he was something of a self-creator, an aristocrat whose many arrests were for sexual assault. After the French Revolution, he reinvents himself as Citoyen Sade and sort of takes credit for the storming of the Bastille, that in fact he was this great revolutionary, and gets away with it for a shockingly long time, too. So he clearly thinks identity is fungible.
So, in a way, he does have a little bit more moral weight, because he's at least worried that there may be a God out there. But by the time you get to the 19th century, you get, in a way, much more superficial people like Beau Brummel, right? So I'd heard the name Beau Brummel, but I didn't really know anything about him. But he really starts this tradition of dandyism. So what is that about?
Absolutely. So the dandyist strain, I think, is one of two sort of strains of self-making we see in the 19th century. I call it in my book the aristocratic strain. We find it more in Europe. And what I find so fascinating about Beau Brummel and the dandies like him, the people who don't just dress beautifully, but make their lives and bodies into a work of art, is that they're simultaneously a kind of liberatory and a reactionary figure. They're an attempt, I think, to, in a time of, again, as in the Renaissance, even perhaps more so now in Regency England, a time of incredible social mobility where one could perhaps through cunning mercantile decisions amass a vast fortune without a title. There becomes this attempt to say, well, how do we think about qualities of specialness, of distinction, that are not linked to money, but also not linked to birth or blood? There's a way of thinking about the dandyist cult as a fundamentally reactionary movement. It's the desire to kind of close the ranks from the wealthy and say, well, you may have money, but you don't have taste. But then again, Brummel is he's from a decent-ish family, upper middle class. He's not an aristocrat, but he is able to go to Eton because his father is able to pay for it. And yet he, in kind of creating this image of the dandy of good taste, who's in what you might call his je ne sais quoi, his ineffable dandyish character, makes him special, set apart, and kind of revives aristocracy in a certain way. There is an aristocracy, there is a group of people who are innately better than others, but it's not necessarily about their family or bloodline. It's just about them, who they are internally. And this is a kind of stream of dandyist thought that we see after after Beau Brummel, in Oscar Wilde, in the French dandies, Barbe d'Orvilliers, for example, and then kind of transformed in a slightly different way into the cult of it in early Hollywood.
So, yeah, you actually have a description of this scene where the Crown Prince actually shows up at some party, who in any kind of traditional hierarchy ranks way above Beau Brummel, but he's very contemptuous because he doesn't dress quite right.
Exactly. Beau Brummel has this sort of weird, unhealthy friendship with the Prince Regent, and of course the Prince Regent is the one you'd think is the one with the power in the situation. But unfortunately, he's not the best looking. He's a bit awkward. He's not well dressed, and Beau Brummel becomes known as the elegant one in their friendship. And despite the fact that he's sort of living on the Prince Regent's dime, so to speak, he's doesn't have the social position. He's able to parlay his famous friendship into a kind of cult of celebrity of his own. And there's a satirical poem of around the time that talks about whose style should you emulate, the Prince Regent's or Beau Brummel? And it's a Brummel wins by a hair. Of course, you can't quite say it, but everybody knows that what Brummel wears is what you wear, not what the Prince wears.
So then you turn to a bunch of Americans, and they have a very different approach to making themselves. In a way, it's a very deep American tradition, the self-made man. But you talk about two big American heroes, Frederick Douglass and Thomas Edison, as exemplars of this trend.
Yes, and I think that they're exemplars of different ends of the spectrum. Perhaps the most idealistic or optimistic self-makers in the book are those in the Douglass tradition. And originally, I think, when this American idea of self-making comes into play, it's what I call the democratic strain in my book. It's linked to ideas of self-governance as key to political governance, that to be internally virtuous in a certain way, which does involve a certain amount of hard work and discipline, and does perhaps result in a stable middle-class existence, is still fundamentally an ethical and civic duty. We are, and you find this in so much of Douglass's work, we are kind of practicing virtue ethics by working hard. And what is wonderful about America is that this ability for the virtuous person, including the hardworking virtuous person, to get ahead regardless of how they were born, where they were born, the circumstances into which they were born, Douglass notably born into slavery. And this is a kind of vision of hope. And so many of the early, or so much of the early narratives of self-making about this time are so rooted in civic virtue. There's, of course, Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography talking about checking every day to make sure that he's lived up to his goals and hasn't wasted any time. But also there's these sort of hagiographies of self-made men that begin to be published around this time, where an industrious American reader could read a biography of Douglas or Abraham Lincoln or what have you, that kind of inspire them to also become self-made. And very notably at this time, these self-makers are not entrepreneurs. They're not wildly wealthy. They might come from nothing and make something of themselves, but there's a kind of financial upper limit. Then in the post-Civil War period, particularly in what's known as the Gilded Age, all that starts to change. And it becomes exclusively about money. That the self-made man is the entrepreneur. And that's also the period where magic comes back to play, or ideas of the divine and the mystical energy come into play. There's a late 19th century self-help / occultist movement known as New Thought, perhaps most analogous to the law of attraction or the secret today. It's this idea that if you simply think positively enough, good things, health or wealth most notably, will come to you. And as this gains traction, around the time, incidentally, that Thomas Edison becomes this seminal cultural figure, both as an inventor and as a celebrity, these ideas start to converge with a sort of rise of popular interest also in evolution and in electricity. There becomes this sense that there's some sort of miasma in the atmosphere. There's some secret force. There's some current, to use the electrical metaphor, which becomes very common in New Thought texts as well. There's currents, there's magnetism, there's energy out there, and if you can just get your internal state, your internal mental state to link up with that energy by thinking positively and focusing on your wealth goals or your health goals, you too can become rich. And all of these self-help books, which sort of claim to be scientific, often they'll use some language of evolution, particularly the sort of Spencerian natural selection. They'll use the language of electricity and magnetism, but the core argument is always the same. If you're not wealthy, it's your fault. And it's not just that you're not working hard enough, and although work sort of ties into it, but that your mind isn't working hard enough. You're not focusing hard enough. You don't want it badly enough. And that's the point where I think this sort of slightly more virtuously inclined American tradition of hard work and positive results turns into this kind of quasi-mysticism of, if you can fit your internal state properly, you can have whatever you desire. And conversely, if you don't have those things, it means that it's your fault in this fundamental way. And we see often the language of New Thought and the language of this kind of mysticism used to combat would-be social reformers. We don't need a welfare state because we're just teaching people to be mentally lazy, is the argument that you see over and over again.
Yeah, this is something I teach when I do my comparative politics course, that in the United States, you have a concept of the deserving and the undeserving poor. And the undeserving poor are people that are just lazy and not willing to work, and they don't really require any help from the state, but maybe the deserving poor, they're just down on their luck, do. And in Europe, this is a completely missing idea. I mean, you talk to a European about the undeserving poor, and they say, what are you talking about? People are trapped by their social conditions and the way they're born, and it has nothing to do with their own efforts. So it is very American. But I guess my reaction is that, the American examples may not be, morally perfect, but they're much more, compared to the Marquis de Sade and Beau Brummel. It seems to me that at least the American version of being self-made has a lot of positive social benefits, right? Frederick Douglass, campaigns against slavery and racial justice. Thomas Edison invents electricity, and everybody benefits. And so that form of self-making, seems to me a bit more positive overall.
Mostly I agree with you, and I certainly think that Douglas is for me the paradigm. He's the best of the self-making tradition. He's my favorite self-maker, you might say. Edison, I'm more divided on, not because his inventions weren't extremely important, but because I think that he actually, in addition, pioneers a certain kind of showmanship and charlatanship, actually, that come to define self-making thereafter in the American tradition. I start my chapter on Edison with a anecdote that early on, when he's inventing or trying to invent the light bulb, he hasn't actually managed to keep it lit for very long. But at this point, he's already a celebrity inventor. He's already got the press drummed up. So he actually he comes up with this canny way of saying, well, journalists can come and look at the lamp, but they can only come in one by one, and they have to leave immediately. So in so doing, every journalist comes, is amazed at the Wizard of Menlo Park and his incredible discovery, and leaves before the light bulb goes out. And it takes, I believe, a couple more years before this is really perfect and ready and usable. And I love that story because, on the one hand, it is the great spirit of American invention and innovation, and it works out in the end for Edison. But at the same time, it tells this other story of Edison, which is as one of the 19th century's great celebrities, he is someone who knows that the relationship with the press is extremely important. He creates this image of himself as this wizard, this genius, the New Jersey Columbus, and he has these close relationships with journalists that often write what he tells them to write in exchange for access to his laboratory. And then he gets celebrities to come. He gets Sarah Bernhardt to come to his lab. And so there is this sort of wizard figure that I think becomes, as the moral tradition recedes, and as perhaps the tradition for innovation recedes a little bit, this idea that as long as you convince the public through newspapers at the time, but also more broadly, reality can be what you make it. That our powers as inventors is to our power is to shape reality. And in that, I think you can see a mirror of Edison in someone like P.T. Barnum, another hoaxer of the time, that says, well, the public loves humbug, give it to them. Humbug's a bit of massaging, but ultimately you're making reality. And so it's not a lie, because the lie becomes the truth. And that, I think, becomes the paradigmatic American version of the story in the 19th century and beyond.
Yeah, well, today we have alternative facts, so it's not, well, okay, so let's get into the more recent times, because it seems to me in the 20th century, you talk about a lot of figures that are self-made that don't seem to have this, at least redeeming side, either socially or economically. I mean, you include Donald Trump, who's an obvious figure. You've got Kim Kardashian, who's kind of the tail end of the book. So it seems to me that the self-making then becomes sort of detached from any real broader social benefit or kind of moral redeeming qualities.
Absolutely. I think we start to see a convergence in the 20th century in particularly the rise of Hollywood celebrity culture of what I call the democratic and the aristocratic models. So the aristocratic model being, there's something innately special about your personality that makes you you, and that gives you as a superiority over others. Then the democratic model of just work really hard and apply yourself, and if you don't achieve a certain amount of superiority over others, it's your fault. That's where the moral quality of the American tradition actually takes on this kind of shadow side of obligation. And I think now we have this narrative that becomes, and I trace it both through the sort of Andy Warhol factory girl celebrity side, but also the techno-utopian side of Silicon Valley, this idea that our personality, something innate in us, is also something to be cultivated, created in accordance with our desires, and then monetized. And I think particularly in everything that I wrote in the book up to that point gets just put into overdrive by the internet, and particularly by social media, because not only are we somewhere where we can create our identities online, we can create our avatars, we can edit our photos and Photoshop and tweak here and there, but also I think more broadly this divinization of desire, this idea that what we want is constitutive of the real. becomes quite literally true when we're looking into our computer screens. The internet and the attention economy on which it runs is about kind of showing you what you want, tracking your desire, tracking your attention, and then feeding it back to you. Mm-hmm. And so more and more of us, it's not just that we can self-create because the internet lets us lie better, although that's certainly true, but also because we spend so much of our lives sort of hooked up for professional reasons, for personal reasons, sort of we can't get away from it, into a sort of divine desire machine. And so I think a cultural trend that was already present is now becoming the dominant ways more and more of us live our lives.
Yeah, especially young men. I mean, it's shocking if you look at the statistics on the amount of time that, young men spend in front of screens playing either video games or, watching superhero movies. And it seems to me both of those in a way are examples. In a video game, you're a shooter, you're a bulked up, demigod, and if someone shoots you, you die, and then you have another life, so you're eternal in that sense. And the superhero movies, I just can't watch these things because I don't really understand what the appeal is. But it does seem to me that if you spend your time in that world, you kind of lose sight of reality, because you actually can make yourself in any way that you want. And I sort of think that the people that attacked the Capitol on January 6th, you had a lot of people like that you couldn't really distinguish between, being in a video game and actually being there in the Capitol, because for them, that had been their world. And if that's the case, we're in a lot of trouble.
I think we are. I wish I could be more positive in the book, and I am very, very concerned that by not just this, by the fact that I think that in the absence of other sources of meaning, and this is where I think Strange Rights and Self-Made dovetail, we've become fascinated with a kind of aestheticized version of being the protagonist. There's a sort of Twitter term for main character syndrome, the idea that we think that we're the protagonist in a drama. But I think we do have it. I think that the kind of unreality and divinization of desire that we experience as part of our everyday lives increasingly is conditioning us to think of ourselves not as members of a community, members of a polity, but as kind of isolated individuals whose desires are engines, and that anything that kind of gets in the way of that is a kind of weird combination of, it's not just that it's repressive or evil, but that it's also unreal. It's constructed. They are, as you say, obstacles in a video game. Someone's disapproval is, or someone sort of pushing back on you in a certain way is simply an obstacle to be overcome as part of this process of self-liberation, self-discovery, self-actualization. And that's not to discount the liberatory promise of self-making. I think, starting from a good place, generally speaking, that social mobility is generally speaking a good thing. And yet we get from the dream of Douglas to something quite nightmarish.
Yeah, so it really struck me in reading your book that you maintain, for the most part, a very morally neutral tone. I mean, you just describe these people, and it's only in the last few pages, at the very end, where you seem to be actually passing a judgment on them. I mean, was that a deliberate choice that you made?
Yes. I think personally I'm torn. I came to this subject with my doctorate in dandyism and theology as someone who loved Oscar Wilde. I was that teenager who loved all of these dandy figures, and I still have a fondness for the idea of living life as art. And yet I think looking at it in the wider story of human history and culture, it's difficult to not see even some of these really compelling figures whose life stories are beautiful in their own right, as contributing to something that I think is incredibly dangerous. That said, I'm very wary of a certain kind of narrative that goes, it was all better in the Middle Ages, and Thomas Aquinas was right about absolutely everything, and, since then it's all downhill, and liberal modernity is awful. And I'm very wary of this narrative, because I think that in this book we find a kind of grasping at something that is true and important, which is there is something about being human that gives us certain kinds of freedoms that are dizzying but also exciting. There is something about our inmost selves and our the dignity of our own personal experiences that is worthy and worthy of regard and worthy of being incorporated into our social and political lives. And yet somehow I think perhaps I would tell the story not as a story of decline, but as of a story of a pendulum swinging too far one way and then too far the other way. And I think that the kind of wrestling with the question of we're human beings and we are so free in some ways and so profoundly not free in other ways, both in terms of being biological animals and in terms of being language-using, storytelling, communal beings that exist sort of in relationship to one another and to stories and indeed language itself. That is sort of we co-construct. That tension. I mean, that is the tension of what a piece of work is a man. This is not a new or particularly novel insight. But I think that rather than talking about this as a story of condemnation or decline, even as I'm very critical of where we are as a culture, I want to think of it as a story of working out what it means to be human is incredibly difficult, and it's unlikely anyone's gotten it quite right. And yet we've kind of collectively as a culture put too much weight on one of these two elements at the expense of the other.
Yeah, so it's an important question whether this is a pendulum or a one-way ticket in liberal societies. I mean, I think that, you can define a liberal society by the belief that everybody has an innate dignity that needs to be respected and protected by the state, and that dignity somehow has to do with our ability to make moral choices. And so it's that moral autonomy that really is at the core of what it means to be human. But then as time progresses, the original understanding of this, the Christian understanding, is that you're a moral being, but there's God's law. And the question is, do you obey God's law? Do you have faith or not? But by the time you get to the 18th, 19th centuries, moral autonomy, the meaning shifts and expands, and so it comes to encompass actually making the law yourself. And I think the apotheosis of that is Nietzsche's Zarathustra, right? Who actually can make the law. He's the freest human being because he doesn't have to simply obey the law, he can actually make the law. And that trope, has been at the basis of a lot of the liberatory movements, but then ones that, don't accept any, inherited framework, moral framework, but simply, want to create everything from the start. And that's not the basis of a kind of stable society.
I remember when I was in grad school that one of the sort of professors on the first day of whatever lecture it was said, everyone talked about Richard Dawkins and being, these new atheists as being the big sort of baddies for Christian theology, but it's Nietzsche. It's only Nietzsche, and he's the only one any of us really have to worry about. And I think that's true. I mean, the book both points to and from Nietzsche in several ways, and yet I myself am divided about whether it will be a pendulum swing or whether we are just what going back would even look like, or how we move away from a conception of the self as making laws in a certain way. I'm curious about, even though I don't know and can't predict how influential there will be, various sort of American social movements right now as responses to or wrestling with this question. I think as I write in Strange Rights, my biggest interest in, for example, the social justice discourse movement is precisely in trying to work out questions of there is something about the ways in which we are born, the things into which we are born, race, gender, class, that define us in certain ways, that we are not sort of simply self-made in that regard. And there seems to be kind of an attempt with perhaps different moral priors, or perhaps still kind of deeply tied into certain contemporary notions of authenticity and internal psychological states. But that does seem to me an interesting movement, in part because one of, I think, the kind of things being taken up into the discourse is there's something real that we are not contending with sufficiently as a society. How do we go about dealing with it? Mm-hmm. And I think you can see in a very, very different and not morally equivalent, to be clear, way, a version of this conversation happening on like corners of what I call the atavistic right, the sort of desire to look at evolutionary psychology and lobster dominance hierarchies as key to something true about humanity. And while I definitely don't want to go down that political rabbit hole at all, I think that what we are seeing is sort of often internet-based, but not exclusively, kind of outcroppings of social questioning that are kind of caught between, let's say, these contemporary notions of authenticity. So many of these sort of the idea that you could talk about simultaneously lobster dominance hierarchies and also have this within a self-help framework of personal betterment is, I think, a distinctly modern version of the obsession with the pre-modern. Yeah. But whether these are just sort of, let me rephrase that. I'm not sure what this will mean at a societal level or a global level, or whether this is just sort of discourse and chatter that is shaping a contemporary generation. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you a more personal question. One of the things that impressed me about your books is that you really know a lot about popular culture, right? About the wellness movement, about Gwyneth Paltrow's, cosmetic line, about SoulCycle, about all of these trends, video gamers and so forth. How do you know so much about this stuff?
Spent too much time on Twitter. Well, the real answer is actually, so I was in many ways sort of grew up in a bit of a bubble. I was homeschooled for a lot of my education, and I studied Oriel College, Oxford, which is not somewhere that knows anything about the modern world. And I was sort of cloistered studying academic theology. And then right out of my doctorate, I took a job at Vox.com, Vox with a V rather than F, as their religion reporter, and moved straight into online journalism and beat reporting, moved back to New York City, where I was from. And because of the nature of both Vox as an institution, and I was the only religion reporter, I ended up covering a lot of wellness and witchcraft stories alongside sort of this was 2017, so evangelicals and Trump and the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis. I'd be covering, witches are hexing Donald Trump, and part of that was a function of the audience of Vox, and part of that was the nature of online journalism, and these were the kinds of stories that social media was saying were playing well. But it got me really interested in, as did, to be clear, just living in New York City in 2017 and kind of being surrounded by all of this, yet still having my sort of theologian hat on. I thought there really is something too fascinating about this sort of online / wellness self-improvement world. I mean, you walk around New York City, and at some point I'm just going to have a Twitter account that's like Strange Rights 2, that's just all of the weird things I see walking around New York. And there's every single advertisement is like, you are your own God, or, create power by looking within. And some of it's, selling crystal shore, but some of it is, selling a scented candle or a gym membership or a sweater. And all of advertising that you just see around you is so theological in character, or so loaded with metaphysical concepts and associations, that I think once you start looking for it, it's absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating. Now, I have to confess, I haven't read any of your novels, but you've written several at this point. You have another one coming out shortly?
That's right. I have 2 already out and a 3rd coming out in January 2024.
That's great. So, which do you prefer? Do you like writing nonfiction, because you seem to be pretty good at it? I mean, there's a lot of information that you convey, but your fiction writing is also important to you.
I think they're in dialogue with each other. I I think I'm a novelist in my soul, but I hate writing novels. The process is sort of painful and awful, and for all that I make fun of, 19th century artists and self-made, I'm the moodiest 19th century romantic of them all when I'm writing. But I think that my work really reinforces, the fiction and the nonfiction reinforce each other. I try to alternate one and one. And it's not just because doing one full-time would drive me crazy, but because I find looking at ideas helpful for framing what I want to think about. And I find writing novels a way of taking these ideas and kind of exploring what they mean for particular people, exploring what they mean in our actual lives. So all of my novels, I think, are theological in their way. Some explicitly about religion, some not. But they're all, I think, about people desperate for meaning and something to hold on to in a world of shifting and competing narratives, and what it looks like to tell the story of oneself to another person, and to find one story of oneself shattered or challenged. And I think one of the difficult things about novels is, especially as a critic of self-making, as a critic of certain kinds of storytelling, is that I think the novel is always caught up in the problem that human beings are liars. We lie to other people, whether we know it or not, and we lie to ourselves. And it's the challenge of the medium of the novel, I think, is stories about people telling stories that are never going to be quite accurate or never going to be fully true. And that tension is, I think, built into the novel form in a way that makes it ideal to explore some of these themes, even as the very limitations of the novel kind of are the same limitations that I sometimes condemn in my nonfiction.
Oh, well, I think your writing altogether is quite, remarkable. I think the thing that I appreciate about the books, your two nonfiction books, is that you bring such a wealth of your academic background, but then you apply it to, ordinary things in the contemporary world in a way that I haven't quite seen other people pull off, as well. And I, want to congratulate you on that, because it's really, I think that background, kind of knowledge of medieval Renaissance thought actually gives you a depth, when you're thinking about the modern world that a lot of other people don't have.
It's very kind. Thank you. I'm very glad that I remember my mother was very dubious when I told her I wanted to study theology, and I'm very glad I did. And I feel like this is just an advertisement for theology as a discipline, because it does. What was great about theology is whether you're someone in a confessional faith or not, is it trains you to get on the inside of how people think about the world, and to see how you think about God affects how you think about your relationships with one another, to your relationship with the natural world. And I think that as a discipline, I'm really, really glad I kind of got that grounding. And I'm sorry that there aren't more places with theology departments now.
No, it really is too bad. I mean, the humanities in general, I think, are really in bad shape, because they've been captured by, basically by versions of, what you're talking about, where culture is everything, kind of self-making, and lost touch with some of the deeper traditions that, have existed in Western thought for a long time. And, students just don't learn that stuff anymore. So, okay, well, Tara Burton, thanks very much for talking to me. That's been really fascinating. Oh, I should mention one last thing, that you have written for American Purpose, the online journal that I helped to found, and so I hope you write for us again.
Yes, I'd love to. Now that I'm not on book deadline, I'm suddenly free. So
yeah, okay.
Thank you for having me, and I'd be delighted.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot.